Chapter 1. The morning at Darnaymead had that delicate, washed brightness which belongs only to an English June after rain. The roses along the low wall still held drops upon their petals, and the damp earth gave off a smell at once clean and faintly melancholy. Miss Marple, in a soft grey shawl despite the mildness of the day, stood with a small basket on her arm and surveyed a bed of pinks with the same attention. Another woman might have given to a duchess. One pink had mildewed at the edge. Another, more flourishing, leaned too greedily over its neighbour. Miss Marple observed both without surprise. Nature, she had often reflected, was very like people in St. Mary Mead. One found the same pushing temper, the same meek endurance, the same occasional flourish of quite unexpected merit. She clipped a stem neatly and went in to luncheon. Her maid-of-all-work, Florence, had laid the tray in the sitting-room because the vicar's wife and Mrs. Bantry were expected shortly after. There was cold chicken, a little pressed tongue, seed cake, and tea in the brown pot with the chipped lid which Miss Marple preferred. She had scarcely poured out when there came the brisk, familiar sound of Dolly Bantry at the gate, as unmistakable as the scolding of a jay. Dolly entered in a hat decorated with 2 cherries of improbable scarlet. She looked, as she usually did, as though she had just escaped from some cheerful disturbance. "My dear Jane," she said, "you are at home, which is fortunate, because the village is not. It is in a condition of complete commotion." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed, one had gathered that something was in the air." Mrs. Price Ridley looked most important at church yesterday. "She would," said Dolly. "It concerns Barton Lodge. Our distinguished newcomer is to preside over the school fete on Thursday, and half the village is pretending not to care in the least." "The retired headmaster," said Miss Marple. "The very man, Mr. Percival Hatherley. Very correct, very learned, very stiff in the back. One feels he has spent his life telling boys not to shuffle. He has brought with him a secretary, a solicitor forever appearing and disappearing, and 1 or 2 shadows from a past which nobody can place, which naturally makes them irresistible." Miss Marple handed her tea. "And which shadows are these?" Dolly settled herself. "There is Miss Cecily Vane, the secretary. A pretty girl in a tired way, with fair hair and dark brows and fingers stained by ink. There is Mr. Lionel Carberry, his solicitor, who wears pince-nez and has eyelashes so pale that one never quite knows whether he is asleep or merely listening. Then there is Mrs. Carber, Vera Dale, a widow staying at the Blue Boar, who is called twice at Barton Lodge, though she pretends not to know Mr. Hatherley at all. And there is Mr. Gerald Fenwick, the young master from Market Basing School, who came over on a bicycle yesterday and looked as though he wished to strike somebody." "Quite a collection," said Miss Marple. Dolly leaned forward. "And there is an object?" Miss Marple's blue eyes brightened a little. "Ah, a bell. A brass school bell. Old, polished, ugly, and somehow rather important. Hatherley is lending it for the fete, because there is to be a small historical display in aid of the new infant's roof. He told the vicar it was connected with an old scholarship foundation. One would not think a bell could create emotion, but, Jane, I assure you it has." Miss Marple took a thoughtful sip. "Objects often do. There was a silver cream jug in this village once which caused more trouble than a young man with curly hair." Dolly laughed. "I remember. Well, this bell has already been stared at by 3 people in a most singular fashion." Miss Vane looked as though she hated it. The widow from the inn touched it as though she were half afraid. and an elderly woman who came up from the station this morning gave one little gasp and nearly dropped dead. Who was she? That is the pretty part. Nobody knows. She had a cheap straw bonnet, a black bag, and a face like an honest sparrow. She asked the way to Barton Lodge, and then changed colour when she heard the bell being tested in the schoolroom. Miss Marple put down her cup. Quite curious, the phrase, in Miss Marple's mouth, carried more meaning than excitement would have done in another woman's. Dolly helped herself to cake. The fete itself will be intolerable, of course. Children reciting, jam stalls, a bran tub, and the vicar speaking of parish unity. But one must go. You will come. Yes, I think so. These little gatherings often show one a good deal. People become agitated over trifles. My dear Jane, I only hope they do. It is the only way to make them useful. After Dolly had gone, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and looked out on the garden path where a robin hopped with an air of proprietary innocence. She was not actively suspicious. It was merely that the names Dolly had brought with her arranged themselves in Miss Marple's mind as tidily as coloured silks in a work-basket. A stern retired headmaster, a weary secretary, a widow calling without acquaintance, a solicitor too pale to read, a young schoolmaster with a temper, and an elderly stranger disturbed by an old brass bell. One could hardly help feeling that some pattern existed, even if the design had not yet shown itself. On Thursday the fete came beneath a high white sky, and a breeze that moved the bunting in the vicarage field. There were stalls under striped awnings, trestle tables set with teacups, the smell of crushed grass, and shrill instructions being offered to children who did not hear them. The bells stood upon the historical table between a sampler and a framed engraving of the old parish pump. It was of solid brass, with a dark wooden handle and an engraved band at the rim. St. Hon. Horace All Scholarship Bell, 1913. Miss Marple read the inscription twice. Mr. Percival Hatherley stood nearby receiving parish compliments with a severity which suggested that compliments were a weak and unnecessary branch of education. He was a tall, elderly man, spare rather than stout, with iron-grey hair brushed ruthlessly back, a narrow face, and a trimmed moustache that might have cut paper. Beside him moved Miss Cecily Vane, slight in dove-coloured muslin, her expression attentive but absent, as if part of her mind were elsewhere, and not at all pleased to be fetched back. Miss Marple noticed, too, Mr. Lionel Carberry. He had delicate hands, and an unwholesome neatness, like a man who never mislaid a document and never forgot an advantage. He looked at the bell briefly, and then away. Mrs. Beecher, Vera Dale, handsome in dark green with a jade brooch at her throat, stared at it longer. Her face had the finished prettiness of a woman who had long understood the value of control. Gerald Fenwick arrived late, sun-browned, square-shouldered with a small white scar running down one side of his chin. He did not join the others. Then the elderly woman in the straw bonnet appeared. She stood quite still at the edge of the crowd. The expression on her face was not theatrical shock, but something smaller and more piercing. Recognition, certainly. Fear, perhaps, or merely memory after many years. She fixed her eyes first on Hatherley, then on the bell, and finally on Lionel Carberry. Her lips parted. Miss Marple saw Mr. Hatherley also see her. For the first time that afternoon his composure altered. It altered very little, but with people of his sort little was enough. His hand, which had rested on the cloth beside the bell, closed for a moment. Then he moved forward. The woman spoke in a low voice. Miss Marple caught only 2 words. "You remember?" Hatherley said something back, very quick and very quiet. Miss Vane turned sharply. Carberry had already come up. Vera Dale, though speaking to Mrs. Price Ridley, was listening. Gerald Fenwick had stopped in the act of lighting a cigarette. It was all done in a moment, and beneath the cover of ordinary village bustle. A child began to cry over a broken toy. The vicar called for silence before the prize-giving. Somewhere behind the tea tent, a saucer fell and smashed. Yet the little knot around the historical table had tightened like a string drawn through cloth. The elderly woman gave a kind of shiver, then allowed Miss Vane to lead her away towards Barton Lodge, which lay only beyond the hedge and a short spinney of beach. Dolly Bantry drifted to Miss Marple's side. "Did you see?" "Yes." "Do you know who she is?" "No, but she has known them before." Dolly lowered her voice. "The widow from the inn is asking questions at the cake stall. Fenwick has gone off in a rage. And Carberry looks as if he has swallowed one of his own papers. I begin to think the fent may justify itself." Miss Marple's gaze remained on the hedge path down which the old woman had disappeared. "Yes," she said. "I think perhaps it may." Across the field, the brass bells stood harmless in the sun, polished, respectable, and entirely in keeping with a church fent. Yet one could not help wondering why so many faces had changed at the sight of it, or why an unknown woman had come all the way to St. Mary Mead, only to whisper with such dreadful certainty, "You remember." What was it that Mr. Hatherley had remembered? Chapter 2. By the following morning, St. Reed's Mary Mead had performed the neat and curious operation, common to villages, of taking a fragmentary occurrence and distributing it among 12 households until everybody possessed a different whole. At the butcher's there was talk of blackmail. At the post office it was said that the stranger was a dismissed governess who had once known Mr. Hatherley in unhappy circumstances. Mrs. Hatherley, Price Ridley, who had observed very little and embroidered a great deal, had already decided there was a foreign element somewhere, though on what grounds she could not have said. Miss Marple, seated by her drawing-room window with a strip of white wool falling over her hands, listened to Florence's account of the latest versions with polite attention. "And Mrs. Weatherby says, miss, that the poor old thing was carried right into Barton Lodge in a dead faint, and the doctor sent for at once. Only Mrs. Weatherby does say such things. Last Michaelmas she said Mr. Simpkins was dying, and he was bowling on the green the same afternoon." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "One must separate the wheat from the chaff, Florence, though often the chaff is more entertaining." Florence, who liked her entertainment substantial, retired unconvinced. A little later there was a ring at the gate, and Dr. Haydock came up the path with his quick, compact step. He was a healthy-looking man with a weathered face, and the expression of one who had long ceased to expect sensible conduct from humanity. "I was sent to tell you," he said, accepting tea without resistance, "that the village may reduce its temperature by a degree or two. The woman is not dead, not dying, and not, so far as I can discover, the abandoned wife of an archbishop. She had a sort of seizure brought on by shock, exhaustion, and, I should say, a good many bad years." Miss Marple looked mild. "Then she is able to speak?" "Not usefully. Her speech was damaged before ever she came to St. Mary Mead. Old stroke, perhaps. She can utter sounds, but not words of much use. Her name, so far as I make out from a card in her bag, is Mrs. Maud Cresswell." "Cresswell," repeated Miss Marple. "That is a respectable and uninformative name." Haydock grinned. Precisely. What is less respectable is the behavior at Barton Lodge. Hatherley insists the woman is an entire stranger. The secretary looks frightened out of her life. The solicitor objects to questions, and the young schoolmaster from Market Basing came back this morning demanding to know whether the woman had mentioned the name of Stourbridge. Stourbridge, yes. Does it convey anything to you? Not at present, but names often do later. Did Mrs. Cresswell write anything? No. Her right hand shakes badly. She sees, hears, and understands well enough, but cannot get things out. Very distressing. Still, she reacted sharply to certain names. Miss Marple put down her knitting. Which names? Hatherley, certainly. Carberry also, unless I am mistaken. And one other thing. When the maid at Barton Lodge rang that brass bell by accident in the hall, the woman became violently agitated. "The scholarship bell," said Miss Marple softly. Haydock gave her a sideways look. "You always sound as though objects had biographies." "So they do," said Miss Marple. "Only people are so careless as not to notice." He laughed, but before he left he added, "I should not gossip, Jane, but Barton Lodge is in a queer state. If you hear anything useful, pass it to me before the village improves it." After he had gone, Miss Marple reflected that when several people denied knowledge too promptly, one might be almost sure that knowledge existed. Mr. Hatherley's denial of Mrs. Bennet, Cresswell in particular, had that unmistakable over-cleanliness which suggested a hasty wiping of the tablecloth. It reminded her of old Mrs. Cudner, Finch, who had denied ever tasting cooking sherry, and had spoken with exactly the same offended emphasis, though the evidence in her case had been under the sideboard. That afternoon, Miss Marple, under the harmless pretext of returning a plate to the vicarage, took a path which led past the side gate of Barton Lodge. The house itself was a square Georgian place of respectable brick and blank white sash windows, standing a little aloof from the lane behind clipped yews. Respectability clung to it. One almost expected it to smell of ink and Latin prose. The side gate stood ajar. Through it one could see a strip of gravel, a flagged terrace, and the maid carrying out a tray with untouched tea. The maid's face wore the solemn importance of a servant inhabiting a household which had become interesting. As Miss Marple paused, a motor car came quickly up the lane and stopped before the front. Mrs. Vera Dale descended. She wore navy this time, with a small hat tilted most becomingly. There was nothing hurried in her movements, and yet haste was present in the very way she shut the car door. A moment later, Gerald Fenwick came round the corner from the garden, evidently having entered by another way. He stopped short at sight of her. Even at a distance one could see the constraint between them. "You ought not to have come," he said. Mrs. Dale answered coolly, "That is hardly for you to decide. It makes it worse." "For whom?" Fenwick's face coloured. "For everyone." Fenwick's face coloured. "For everyone." She gave a little laugh that was not amused. "My dear Mr. Fenwick, things became worse long ago." Miss Marple moved on, not from delicacy, but because observation from immobility is often more noticeable than people suppose. Yet she had seen enough to feel that whatever connected Barton Lodge with the past, it linked Fenwick and Vera Dale as well as Hatherley. An hour later, Dolly Bantry arrived, bringing with her all the freshness of a person who had learned something unsuitable. "Jane, there is more. Mrs. Cresswell is not at Barton Lodge now." "Indeed?" Carberry insisted she should be taken to the Blue Boar, where there is more quiet, though one cannot think why quiet should be improved by taking a sick woman to an inn. Mrs. Jackal Harmon at the Blue Boar says the poor creature keeps trying to communicate something and cannot. She stares and blinks and taps with one finger on the sheet. "Binks," said Miss Marple. "Yes, in the oddest way. Not merely ordinary blinking. Quick, then slow, then quick again. Mrs. Harmon said it gave her the creeps, which was unfeeling but perhaps natural. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her hands had grown still over the knitting. Dolly, who knew that stillness, looked sharper. "What is it?" "It may be nothing," said Miss Marple. "Only years ago Raymond once had a friend who was in the Navy and taught us all a little Morse code after dinner. Dots and dashes, you know. Quite foolish, but one remembers trifles, and blinking, if one could not speak, might serve as well as tapping." Dolly stared. "My dear Jane, you cannot mean that the witness blinked in Morse code." Miss Marple gave a faint cough. "One must not jump to conclusions. Still, if Mrs. Cresswell is indeed a witness, and if she blinked in Morse code, someone else may already have understood it." At that moment, there came a sharp knock at the front door. Florence admitted a boy from the Blue Boar with a folded note upon a tray. It was from Mrs. Harmon, written in a large, hurried hand. "Can any lady come at once to sit with poor invalid while I attend to kitchen? She is terrible uneasy since gentleman called." Miss Marple rose. "A gentleman," said Dolly. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and took up her gloves. "Yes," she said, "and I wonder which gentleman has been before us, and what message he feared the witness might blink next." Chapter 3. The Blue Boar stood a little back from the high road, with a signboard that creaked when the wind altered and windows which had the bubbled look of old glass. Inside there was the agreeable smell of ale, beeswax, and onions, overlaid now by a sharper scent of lavender water and carbolic from the upstairs room where Mrs. Maud Cresswell had been installed. Mrs. Maud Cresswell had been installed. Harmon met Miss Marple at the foot of the stairs, wiping her hands upon her apron with an agitation that was perfectly sincere and a little enjoyed. "I am thankful you have come, miss. She will not settle at all, poor soul, and after that gentleman had been with her, she was in such a taking that I thought she would bring the whole place down." "What gentleman was that?" asked Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Harmon lowered her voice, though there was no one to overhear. "Mr. Carberry, miss. He said he came on legal business." "Legal gentlemen do always say that, I notice, when one would prefer them to say what they mean." "He was not above with her 5 minutes, and when he came down he had a face like linen. That is his ordinary expression," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Harmon, who valued justice, conceded the point. "Well, more so than usual, then." They went upstairs. The room was small but clean, with a white dimity curtain, a washstand, and a faded rug before the grate. Maud Cresswell lay propped among pillows. She was a thin, elderly woman with a sparrow's bones and a face worn into fine lines by work, weather, and disappointment. Her bonnet had been set carefully on a chair, and her black bag lay beside it. Her eyes, however, were very much alive. They fixed themselves upon Miss Marple with a strained and deliberate appeal. Miss Marple came to the bedside and took the poor trembling hand. "Mrs. Cresswell," she said, "I think you wish to tell somebody something. If I do not understand at once, you must forgive me." The old woman made a small sound in her throat. Then she blinked. It was not the ordinary involuntary motion of a tired eye. There was order in it, 2 quick closures, a pause, one prolonged, another pause. Miss Marple sat very still. Raymond's naval friend had been absurd and tiresome in many respects, but he had insisted that everybody at the dinner table learn the alphabet properly. and Miss Marple had always been one of those people who remember trifles because they respect them. Blink, blink, pause. A little line came between her brows. Then Maud blinked again, slowly, painfully, with visible effort. Miss Marple said softly, "Mrs. Harmon, would you stand by the window and say nothing for a moment? I wish to watch." The blinking continued. Dot, 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 dash, dot, 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 a pause, dash, dot, dot, dot. Miss Marple felt a faint stir at the base of her spine. It was not excitement. Excitement is a most untidy thing. It was rather that neat inward movement which comes when a row of scattered pins suddenly arranges itself. "B," she murmured, "E-L-L." Mrs. Harmon stared. Miss Marple raised a finger. "Yes. Bell. The bell." At the word, Maud Cresswell gave a little convulsive nod. Her fingers plucked weakly at the coverlet, then moved toward her bag. Miss Marple opened it, and found, among a handkerchief, a purse, and a bottle of smelling salts, a folded newspaper cutting from the Market Basing Gazette. It contained a brief notice of the vicarage fete and the historical display, with special mention of the old St. Honoria scholarship bell, kindly lent by Mr. Percival Hatherley of Barton Lodge. There was also an old programme, yellowed and rubbed at the fold. St. Honoris School, Stored Bride's Speech Day, July 1913. Miss Marple read the line twice. Then she looked back at the old woman. "You came because you saw this," she said. "And when you saw the bell again, you remembered." Maud's eyes filled. She blinked once, hard. "What about the bell?" asked Miss Marple. The witness tried again. This time the sequence broke down halfway. She had spent too much strength already. The lids fluttered, the hand moved helplessly, and at last she turned her face aside with the pitiful anger of an intelligent creature trapped inside disobedient flesh. Mrs. Harmon said in a whisper, "I never heard of such a thing." The witness blinked in Morse code as plain as print. "Yes," said Miss Marple, still watching Maud. "And somebody else may already have understood enough to be alarmed. When they left the room, they found Dr. Curry coming up the stairs. He listened to Miss Marple with a skepticism which gave way, rather unwillingly, to interest. If you are right, Jane, the woman is trying to direct attention to the bell. That is clear enough, but to what end? That is not yet clear, said Miss Marple. Only Mr. Carberry had no business to visit her before anyone who wished honestly to help. Haydock frowned. No, and Hatherley has sent for Carberry again this evening. That is still less comfortable. They came out into the yard behind the inn. A cart was standing there with beer barrels, and a black cat sat beneath it with the detachment of one who disapproved equally of commerce and emotion. On the lane beyond, Mr. Lionel Carberry was walking away toward Barton Lodge. He did not look back. He held his gloves too tightly in one hand, and though his face remained pale and orderly, the set of his shoulders was not composed. Miss Marple watched him go. He has heard the word bell, she said, half to herself. The question is whether he thinks it means the same thing that Mrs. Cresswell means. Dr. Haydock glanced at her. You believe there are two meanings? My dear doctor, there are often three. That is what makes life so very fatiguing. She turned homeward more slowly than usual. The bell, the old school at Stourbridge, the thin witness who blinked in Morse code, the solicitor who had called too soon the headmaster, who denied recognition rather too neatly, and those others who hovered round the edges with grievances of their own. None of it yet formed a tidy picture. Yet one detail persisted with a small irritating force. If Maud Cresswell wished merely to accuse a man, why blink bell? Why not a name? And if she meant the brass bell itself, what could a village-fent object possibly conceal after all those years? Chapter 4. Barton Lodge looked particularly respectable in the afternoon light, which did not improve it. It was one of those houses which seemed to stand with folded arms. The laurels had been clipped, the gravel raked, and the front door brass polished to a virtue. Miss Marple, arriving with the harmless purpose of returning the sainted, honorious programme, which Maud Cresswell had dropped from her bag, was shown into the study by a maid named Elsie Tarrant. Elsie was one of those young women who give an impression of scarcely existing until one notices that they have seen everything. She had pale mouse-coloured hair, long wrists, and the silence that was not stupidity, but caution. Her eyes moved once to the bell upon the escritoire and away again. Mr. Percival Hatherley rose from behind a writing-table crowded with papers in straight, uncompromising lines. In daylight he seemed even more like the idea of a headmaster than the reality. One expected him to carry chalk dust in his cuffs. "Miss Marple," he said with formal courtesy. "You are very good." Miss Marple handed him the programme. "I thought it might be of interest." Mrs. Cresswell had it with her. He took it. For a moment the dryness of his face altered, not into softness, but into weariness. "Yes," he said. "Sort honorious. A long time ago." The bell stood within a foot of his hand. Up close, it was heavier than it appeared, and the dark wooden handle showed a faint groove near its base, as though it might once have been twisted. One side of the engraved brass had a small scorched mark, blackened into the metal. Miss Marple let her eyes rest on it. A handsome object. It was presented for the scholarship examinations. It hung for many years outside my study. Then it has rung for a good many hopeful boys. "And a good many disappointing ones," said Hatherley. There was some dryness in the reply, but not much amusement. Miss Marple thought, with her usual detached charity, that stern men often become sterner because they cannot forgive themselves for having once been weak. "You recognized Mrs. Cresswell yesterday," she said. He gave her a sharp look. "Did I?" "Yes." He was silent long enough to make denial foolish. "At first," he said at last, "I did not. She is greatly altered. Later, I remembered her as a parlour-maid attached to the schoolhouse at Stourbridge. She was a decent woman. Why she should appear in St. Mary Mead now, I cannot tell. Perhaps because she saw the bell." His hand moved, almost imperceptibly, to the edge of the tablecloth beside it. "Perhaps," he said, "Miss Marple did not press. Pressure is useful with hot-tempered people. With dry people, it merely hardens them. Instead," she said, "you have several visitors who also seem interested in Stourbridge." He looked annoyed. "Mrs. Bellbridge. Dale is an importunate woman. Fenwick is an insolent young fool. My secretary is more sensitive than is practical, and Carberry—" Here he paused very slightly. "Carberry, my solicitor." "Quite." There came a knock, and Miss Cecily Vane entered with a shorthand pad. She looked more tired than ever, but her prettiness had sharpened under strain. A faint smudge of violet ink marked the side of her right thumb. "Mr. Wrighthree, Hatherley, Mrs. Dale is here again." A pulse beat visibly in Hatherley's temple. "Show her in." Vera Dale came in at once, as though she had already been waiting outside the door. She wore grey silk and a hat with a narrow veil. Her face remained handsome because she had disciplined it, but bitterness had refined rather than coarsened her. She stopped at sight of Miss Marple, then inclined her head. "I am sorry. I did not know you were engaged." Hatherley said stiffly, "Miss Marple is leaving." Miss Marple rose. As she did so, she saw Vera's glance go not to Hatherley, but to the bell. There was anger in that look and something almost like disgust. At the door she heard Vera say, very low and very distinct, "You cannot put this right with checks and signatures, Mr. Hatherley. Arthur is still dead." The old man answered in a voice equally low, "And I suppose you imagine I have forgotten that." Miss Marple went out into the hall, where Elsie Tarrant was dusting a table already free from dust. The girl's hands did not pause, but her eyes flickered toward the study door. "Busy house," said Miss Marple kindly. "Yes, miss. Many callers. Yes, miss. Many callers. Yes, miss." Miss Marple might have gone further, but one cannot rush a creature like Elsie. She thanked her and left. That evening, just before dusk, Dolly Bantry came in without ceremony, carrying a basket of gooseberries and news in equal measure. Rira Dale quarrelled with Hatherley, Gerald Fenwick quarrelled with him after her, Cecily Vane cried in the shrubbery, and Carberry came at 7 and stayed till nearly 8. "I know, because the butcher's boy saw him go." Miss Marple nodded. "And the bell?" Dolly blinked. "What of it?" "The bell is in the study. It has a scorched mark and a handle that may perhaps turn. My dear Jane, must every object in this business conceal something?" "Not at all. Sometimes they merely remind people." As if to contradict her, there came at that instant, through the quiet of the village evening, the sudden clear note of a brass bell. It was not loud, but it travelled distinctly over hedge and lawn. Dolly started. That was from Barton Lodge. Yes, but why ring it now? Miss Marple laid down her knitting and listened to the silence that followed. One ring only. Not a summons, then, and not an accident, unless a singular one. At Daymead the dusk settled gently over the sweet peas. Somewhere a thrush gave a tentative phrase and ceased, as though it too were waiting. Who had rung the old scholarship bell in the emptying light, and for whom had that solitary note been meant? Chapter 5. By the next morning the business had acquired, as many old scandals do, a curious divided existence. In public it remained vague and well-mannered. In private it grew roots and names. Miss Marple, who had no false horror of names when they were useful, sat in Dolly Bantry's morning room at Dossington Hall, while Dolly moved restlessly among flowers that the gardener had arranged much better than she thought possible. "I wish people would either confess or be quiet," Dolly declared. "This in-between stage is most fatiguing." "It is the natural stage," said Miss Marple, "like fruit before it ripens or spoils." Dolly considered that neither poetic nor helpful. Cecily Vane had agreed, after some hesitation, to call. When she came, she wore a plain blue frock and looked as though she had slept little. Her fair hair was very neatly dressed, but fatigue had hollowed the soft places beneath her eyes. "I do not know why I have come," she said almost at once. "Only I think perhaps Mr. Time Hatherley intended to tell you something. He said yesterday that village ladies often understand more than policemen." "How sensible of him," said Dolly. Miss Marple gave her a glance and waited. Cecily clasped and unclasped her hands. "My father was Edwin Vane. He was porter and odd-job man at St. Honoria's School in Stourbridge. In 1913, money went missing from the scholarship trust bonds, I believe, and certain papers. Father was accused because his signature appeared upon a receipt he swore he had never signed. He was dismissed. We were ruined. My mother never recovered from it. Father died saying he had been tricked. And you became Mr. Hatherley's secretary? Yes, under another reference. He did not know who I was at first. Later I think he guessed. He was not kind exactly, but he grew different these last months. Uneasy. He asked many questions about old records. Did you come for revenge? Asked Miss Marple. Cecily looked straight at her. I came for truth. If revenge followed, I did not promise to object. When she had gone, Gerald Fenwick arrived, hat in hand, all awkward honesty and badly governed temper. The little scar on his chin whitened when he was angry. I suppose I am already accounted a suspect of something, he said. One may as well begin properly. I am engaged to Miss Vane, though Mr. Hatherley did not approve. I wrote to him anonymously in the winter, asking whether he intended before he died to clear Edwin Vane's name. You chose an imprudent method, said Miss Marple. I know it. I am not good at circumnavigation. His mouth twisted. I saw Mrs. Dale leave yesterday. Then I went in and told Hatherley he had behaved like a coward 30 years ago and like a coward since. He did not deny the charge. Did you mention Stourbridge? Yes, and Arthur Dale. After him came, by one of those arrangements which no one makes and everyone notices, Vera Dale herself. She sat elegantly upon the edge of a chair and removed one glove finger by finger. My husband, Arthur Dale, was second master at St. Honorius, she said. A weak man, perhaps, but not a villain. When the theft occurred, he gave evidence that helped condemn Vane. Mr. Burvey, Hatherley urged him to stand by the school for the school's sake. Arthur did so. Afterwards he believed Vane innocent. It made a wreck of him. And you came to demand acknowledgement? And money, said Vera cruelly. Let us not be romantic. A ruined reputation may not be repaired, but an annuity is something. Mr. Hatherley understood that. He promised to alter his will. That was new. Miss Marple stored it. What of Mr. Carberry? She asked. Vera's face altered very little, yet enough. I did not know him in those days, she said. At least I do not remember him. Miss Marple thought that the sentence would have been better had it stopped earlier. Later in the afternoon she encountered Mr. Carberry himself on the lane. He lifted his hat with exact propriety. In daylight his pale eyelashes gave him that unfinished look which some fair men possess, as if the painter had forgotten the last touches. A distressing business, he murmured. Yes, Mr. Hatherley has been much harassed by old grievances. It is unfortunate that persons with imperfect memories should revive matters beyond use. Miss Marple smiled. Old memories are often more exact than convenient ones. He looked at her in a manner meant to be bland. Indeed. I understand you were acquainted with Mrs. Cresswell yesterday. I called only because I had legal charge of certain arrangements. Poor woman. Quite incapable. Not entirely, said Miss Marple. He gave the smallest pause. So I am told. This nonsense of the witness who blinked in Morse code has already reached the village, I suppose. Delightful. The dryness of the word made it less delightful. When he had gone, Miss Marple reflected that there are men who despise other people's intelligence because they secretly fear it. Lionel Carberry had the air of one who had spent years explaining things away. Toward evening, Elsie Tarrant came up the path to Danemid with a covered dish from Barton Lodge and the message that Mr. Trabe. Hatherley regretted an earlier abruptness and would be obliged if Miss Marple could call upon him privately the next morning at 11. Elsie delivered this in one breath, her hands folded very tightly. "Thank you, Elsie," said Miss Marple. "You have had a busy day." "Yes, miss. You rang the bell last evening." The girl gave a quick, frightened glance. "No, miss, not me. But someone did." "Yes, miss. Who?" Elsie's lips parted, then closed. Her eyes shifted toward the road. She was not unwilling, Miss Marple thought, merely terrified of becoming visible in a house where too much had become visible already. "It was after Mr. Hack. Carberry came, miss," she whispered. "That is all I know." And that, plainly, was all she dared know. If Hatherley wished to see Miss Marple privately in the morning, he had perhaps decided at last to speak. Yet why wait until morning when so many people with old injuries had gathered about him now? And why, if the bell had rung after Carberry's visit, had Hatherley not sent for the police instead? Chapter 6. At 10:30 the next morning, Barton Lodge no longer had the aspect of a stiff old house, preserving its proprieties. It had become a house into which people ran. The front door stood open. Voices moved sharply through the hall. A gardener lingered where he ought not. Florence, who had heard everything from the grocer's assistant, arrived at Danemede White with satisfaction and alarm. "Mr. Hatherley is dead, miss." Miss Marple put down her sewing. Dr. Haydock met her on the gravel, and the line between his brows answered before he spoke. "He is certainly dead," he said. "The housemaid found him in the study at about 9:15. He was on the hearth rug with a bruise on one temple. There is a cushion on the floor beside the sofa, and the bell is down as well, as if both had been knocked from the table in some struggle." "Struggle," repeated Miss Marple. "Possibly, or he fell. He was an elderly man with a none too steady heart." "But I do not like it." Inside, Inspector Slack had already arrived from market basing with the energetic dissatisfaction of a man who resented being summoned by circumstances rather than by rank. He greeted Miss Marple without enthusiasm. "I dare say, madam, that every teacup in the village has a theory already." "Not every teacup," said Miss Marple. "Some are sensible." Slack made a noise in his nose and turned away. The study showed disturbance without melodrama. One drawer of the writing table had been pulled out farther than the rest. The brass bell lay on its side upon the rug, its handle half twisted, and a chair near the fire had been knocked awry. Hatherley's body had been removed, but the emptiness where it had lain remained almost more expressive than the sight itself would have done. Cecily Vane sat in the morning room with smelling salts and a look of exhausted horror. Vera Dale was standing by the window, self-command restored but not ease. Gerald Fenwick paced like a large dog in too small a room. Carberry, impeccable as ever, had taken possession of a side table and arranged several papers upon it, as though legal order might master death if given enough room. Miss Marple noticed that his gloves were new. Slack began with the household. Elsie Tarrant, white to the lips, said she had taken in a tray at 8, and, finding no answer, gone away. At 9, she returned with letters and saw the study door ajar. Hatherley lay on the floor. She screamed, and cook came. "And last night?" asked Slack. "There were callers, sir." "How many?" "Miss Vane had dictation in the study till near 7. Mr. Vane had dictation in the study till near 7. Carberry came about 7 and left before 8. Mr. Fenwick was there after 8, I think. Mrs. Dale had gone by then." Mr. Hatherley had hot milk at 10 and said he would read. Who took the milk? Miss Vane, sir. Cecily gave a faint, involuntary movement. Gerald stopped pacing. Slack nodded like a man receiving exactly what he had expected. Before he could press further, Mrs. One Harmon of the Blue Boar burst in, quite forgetting that inns and murder investigations are not conducted upon the same footing. I beg pardon, sir, but I had to come. Somebody tried to smother that poor invalid in the night. Even Slack was startled. What? Mrs. Harmon, breathing hard, went on. Mrs. Cresswell. I found her this morning with the pillow half over her face and the coverlid dragged. She was in a state, poor soul, and there was mud on the window-sill. If I had not heard her knocking against the headboard with her hand. Miss Marple closed her eyes a moment. The witness had spoken again, in her fashion, and someone had answered. Slack said sharply, Why was I not informed at once? I came as soon as I could, sir. But then I heard of this. The inspector's colour deepened. So now we have not only a dead gentleman, but this absurd tale of the witness who blinked in Morse code and an attempted murder at the inn. The whole countryside appears to have gone melodramatic. No, said Miss Marple quietly. Only frightened. Slack did not reply. He was too busy looking round for the person who had had best reason to fear both Hatherley and Maud Cresswell. His gaze rested unsurprisingly on Cecily Vane, whose father had been disgraced on Gerald Fenwick, who had quarrelled openly on Vera Dale, whose husband was dead by consequence of the old scandal, and finally on Carberry, who remained pale and smooth and apparently composed. Miss Marple, however, was looking at the bell. Its handle had indeed been twisted. Not far, but enough to show that someone had tried to turn it and either failed or been interrupted. On the brass near the rim was a dull smear, as if hastily rubbed with a handkerchief. If Hatherley had discovered what Maud meant by bell, he may have tried to open it. If another person understood the same thing, the struggle in the study became more than possible. Yet which of them knew that the old brass object mattered? Which of them had gone from frightened curiosity to violence in a single night? And had Mr. Dench, Hatherley, at last found something before he died, or merely frightened his killer by almost finding it? Chapter 7. The inquest opened 2 days later and adjourned itself, as such proceedings often do, upon the admirable principle that uncertainty may be formal without becoming clearer. Mr. Hatherley had died of suffocation. Dr. Hatherley, Haydick said with reluctance, though the bruise at the temples suggested a fall during resistance. Murder, therefore, was no longer a matter of village embroidery, but of fact. That afternoon Cecily Vane came to Ganymede and asked if she might speak privately. She held herself with visible effort. Only the fingers of one hand trembled. I have done a foolish thing, she said. Or perhaps not foolish, only dangerous. I took papers from Mr. Hatherley's desk before the police sealed the room. Dolly Bantry, who happened to be present and had no intention whatever of leaving, made a sympathetic sound. Cecily drew out a packet tied with faded green tape. Some are only school records, but among them was this. It was a letter, never posted, written in Mr. Hatherley's dry, upright hand. Miss Marple read, To whom it may concern, I have for many years believed that Edwin Vane was wrongly accused in the matter of the St. Honorius Scholarship Trust. At the time I suppressed my doubts for the sake of the school, which I now perceive to have been a cowardly and ruinous decision. New information lately brought to my notice causes me to suspect that the true offender was a younger member of staff who left shortly thereafter and who may now be living under another name. The rest broke off unfinished. There were other papers. An account book, a list of staff from 1913. a memorandum concerning scholarship bonds sold without authority, and between them, folded twice, an old letter in another hand entirely, blotched and cramped. It had been written by Edwin Vane to Hatherley, but never sent. Sir, I know you do not believe me, though you say as how there is no more to be done. I tell you again, I never signed no receipt, only the paper that gentleman asked me to fetch from the study. Mrs. Cresswell saw him there after bell. She said she would speak if asked. Ask her, sir. Ask Maud Cresswell. Miss Marple sat back. After bell, she said softly. Cecily looked from one face to the other. Do you see now? Father always said a woman named Maud knew something. Mr. Beffery, Hatherley must have found this letter among his old papers. That is why he was altered. That is why he took me into his confidence a little at the end. He even said he meant to make amends. Dolly leaned forward. By his will? Cecily coloured. Yes. I saw a draft codicil. He intended to leave me £500 and Mrs. Dale an annuity of £100 a year. He wrote that it was not justice but acknowledgement. Astonishingly sensible for a headmaster, said Dolly. Miss Marple was reading the staff list. There, among the names, stood Mr. Lionel Bell, Jr., Classics Master. She said nothing for a moment. Cecily went on. Mr. Carberry told Mr. Hatherley that old matters should be left alone. I heard him say so through the door. He spoke as if he had authority. Yet why should a solicitor care whether an injustice 30 years old is repaired? Quite, said Miss Marple. There was one more item in the packet, a newspaper clipping from the Stourbridge Herald, 1914, reporting the sudden departure of Mr. Lionel Bell from St. Honorius owing to private reasons. Private reasons, said Dolly. There is a phrase behind which the English have hidden nearly everything unpleasant since the conquest. Cecily gave a strained laugh and then clasped her hands again. You think Mr. Carberry and Lionel Bell are the same man? I think it possible, said Miss Marple. Not proven, but possible. The eyelashes, said Cecily suddenly. Father once wrote in his pocket diary, I did not bring it, but I remember he called Bell that fair-lashed gentleman because he looked so mild. Miss Marple's eyes lifted. Did he indeed? Outside the window, the village moved in its ordinary way. A boy wheeled a bicycle past. Somewhere, a cart rattled. It seemed almost indecent that so much commonplace life should continue, while an old wrong quietly came back from 1913 and sat among the teacups. Cecily rose to go. At the door she turned. If Maud Cresswell is the witness, she said, and if she blinked Bell, then perhaps she meant Lionel Bell and not the object at all. It is possible, said Miss Marple. Yet when Cecily had gone she remained doubtful, for Edwin Vane's letter said after Bell. Not simply Bell, and Hatherley had been found beside the actual brass bell, with the handle half turned. That was too much coincidence, even for human folly. Either the witness meant both things at once, or else somebody had been misled by one meaning into missing the other. Miss Marple drew the bell, the dead headmaster, the false or changed name, and the unfinished confession together in her mind. If Carberry had once been Bell, he had reason enough to kill. But reason is not the same as proof, and proof, like jam, must be properly boiled before it was set. What, then, had been hidden after Bell, and who had understood that phrase first? Chapter 8. Inspector Slack, having now an actual murder rather than a village disturbance, became more professional and less agreeable. Gerald Fenwick was invited to the station and kept there for several hours, partly because he had quarrelled with Hatherley, and partly because a torn strip from his coat lining was found upon a nail in the study door. Gerald admitted both anger and a late call, but denied violence, with a frankness that was either innocence or excellent nerve. Vera Dale, meanwhile, sent word that she intended to leave the Blue Boar and return to London, which caused Slack to forbid her departure and Dolly Bantry to pronounce her theatrical. Cecily Vane remained at Barton Lodge under a kind of strained liberty. Carberry moved in and out, advising everyone, restraining everyone, and making himself useful in that chilly, efficient manner which often conceals a great wish to command the story. Miss Marple visited the Blue Boar again. Maud Cresswell had been moved to a downstairs parlour for safety. The old woman looked weaker, but the eyes followed everything. Mrs. Moat Harmon, full of protective indignation, stood with folded arms like a stout guardian saint. "She shall not be left alone again," she said. "Not while I have a frying pan and my senses." "An excellent combination," said Miss Marple. She went to the bedside and spoke gently. "Mrs. Cresswell, you told me, Belle. I want very much to understand the rest." Maud blinked at once, fiercely. The lids moved with painful deliberation. Dash. Dot dot. Pause. Dash dot. Dash. Dot. Miss Marple frowned. It came too slowly and irregularly. Then she realized that the old woman was not beginning a new message, but repeating a final fragment. She took pencil and paper. Again the lids moved. Miss Marple wrote down the nearest equivalent she could make of the effort. "Turn, turn," she said. Maud closed her eyes once in unmistakable assent. Mrs. Harmon gave a gasp. "Turn the bell. That would seem likely." Miss Marple stood very still. Not Bell the man, then, or not only Bell the man. Bell, turn. The thing could open. Someone had indeed tried in the study. Someone else had perhaps failed. On her way out, she met Elsie Tarrant by the gate of Barton Lodge. The girl started as though she had been caught at theft. "You went to the inn last night with broth for Mrs. Way, Cresswell," Miss Marple said, not because she knew it, but because such guesses often succeed. Elsie stared. "How did you know, miss? You have a broth-coloured stain upon your cuff. Did you go alone?" Elsie shook her head after a pause. "Mr. Carberry walked with me part of the way. He said he would see that the poor lady was comfortable, but he did not come inside." "Are you sure?" "Yes, miss. Leastways, not by the front." The distinction was useful, and after Mr. Hatherley was found, Elsie's hands twisted together. "I saw the bell on the floor, miss." Mr. Carberry picked it up before the inspector came. Only for a moment. He wiped it with his handkerchief and set it down again. He said there was no sense in leaving fingerprints for gaping servants, though I did not know what that meant rightly. Miss Marple almost smiled. Men who pride themselves on superior control often commit the small unnecessary act that betrays them. "Thank you, Elsie." The girl looked miserable. "I did not want trouble, miss." No one ever does. That evening Miss Marple sat alone by the window at Dinermead and turned the pieces over. Carberry. Perhaps Bell. Maud's message. Bell and turn. Hatherley dead beside the half-opened object. Elsie's account of Carberry polishing the bell after the murder. Like a man obeying an old reflex from detective stories he ought never to have imitated. Yet one question remained bothersome. If the bell contained proof, why had Hatherley not found it long ago? And if Maud herself had once hidden something there, Why had she kept silence through so many wasted years? The answer came not as an illumination, but as a homely comparison. It reminded Miss Marple of old Mrs. Sue Cleet, who had hidden 3 sovereigns in the tea caddy during a burglary scare and then forgotten them until the tea ran out 2 years later. Fear produces both cunning and nonsense. A frightened servant girl in 1913 might easily hide a paper in the nearest hollow object and then lose her chance, her courage, or her place. Miss Marple rose. Tomorrow there must be an opportunity to examine the bell properly. But how to do that under Inspector Slack's eye, with suspects moving about Barton Lodge like flies on jam? And if the object yielded what she expected, would it prove only the old crime or the new murder as well? Chapter 9. Opportunity, when it came, wore the plain face of village procedure. The coroner required certain personal papers from Hatherley's study, the police having searched that room twice with much moving of chairs and little imagination, allowed Miss Marple in under Dolly Bantry's escort to assist Cecily in sorting merely sentimental articles from legal ones. Slack, occupied in the hall with Gerald Fenwick and a misplaced fountain pen, waved them through with impatience. The bell remained on the study table. Miss Marple moved papers slowly, respectably, and without the least appearance of interest. Dolly, who had been instructed only by the pressure of a glance, stood near the door and talked aloud about the absurdity of labelled cardboard boxes. Cecily, pale but steady, bent over drawers. When Miss Marple's hand touched the wooden handle of the bell, she felt at once that the threading had already loosened. Someone had twisted it hard and not finished. She took up a sheet of blotting paper and wrapped it about the grip. "Quite dusty," she murmured. Then, very gently, she turned. The handle gave with a tiny dry catch. From within the hollow shaft slid a rolled fragment wrapped in old waxed paper and tied with black cotton, brittle as spun glass. Miss Marple's heart made that neat inward movement again. She slipped the roll into her knitting bag and replaced the handle. Dolly, continuing magnificently upon cardboard receptacles, did not falter once. Back at Darneymead, they opened the packet together. Time had yellowed the paper, but not destroyed it. There were 3 items. The first was a counterfoil from the Stourbridge County Bank, recording the deposit of scholarship trust bonds for temporary sale on instructions signed E. Vane. The signature, however, was followed by a notation in another hand, taken over by L. Bell. The second paper was a half-burned letter, never posted. Bell. This cannot continue. I will not have Vane bear it. Restore the papers before speech day, or I go to H.A. Jadumber. E. D. Arthur Dale. The third item was the most decisive of all, a scrap of school notepaper on which someone, perhaps in haste, had practiced Edwin Vane's signature several times and then written beneath it, "Cobb," crossed out savagely before completion. Dolly stared. "Cobb, Jane." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Carberry, or the beginning of it. A man trying out a new signature, perhaps, or combining an old name with a future one. Lionel Bell became Lionel Carberry, or was becoming him even then." Cecily had gone white. "Then father was innocent?" "Yes." She sat down and covered her face. It was not grief exactly, nor relief, but the collapse of a strain carried too long. Miss Marple laid the papers straight. "This proves the old theft and the changed name strongly enough for any reasonable mind. What it does not by itself prove is the murder of Mr. Hatherley." "No," said Dolly reluctantly. "Though if I found such things hidden in a bell after 20 years, I should certainly suspect the man who had been trying to open it." "So should I." But suspicion is not enough for slack. There was more, however, in the papers than Dolly had first noticed. On the back of Arthur Dale's letter was a smear of dark grease, old and rubbed. Miss Marple looked at it a long time. "School machinery, ink? No," she said. "Bell polish. Maud must have hidden the papers in the bell after picking them up from the study grate or desk. She was in service. She would think first of cleaning." She sat very quiet then. In silence patterns clarified themselves. Hatherley had been searching his old records and found Edwin Vane's unsent letter naming Maud. Maud saw the newspaper notice and came. She blinked Bell and then turned. Carberry, hearing or guessing enough, visited her and understood. He went to Hatherley that night. Perhaps Hatherley had already begun to unscrew the handle. Perhaps he accused Carberry outright. Then came fear, violence, suffocation, and a hurried, unsuccessful search. Later, Carberry attempted again and was interrupted, hence the half-turned handle and the wiping with the handkerchief. Dolly let out a long breath. "My dear, we must tell Slack at once." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but first I should like all the principal persons together. A thing explained before everyone often loosens the final thread. Also," and here she folded the papers back into their wrapping, "I wish Maud Cresswell to be present if she is able. The witness who blinked in Morse code ought not to be robbed of her place at the end." Dolly looked at her with admiration. "You sound almost formidable, Jane." "No," said Miss Marple, rising. "Only tidy. There is still one small matter. When Arthur Dale wrote, 'I go to H,' he meant Hatherley. But why did Hatherley never act then? Was it cowardice only, or had someone frightened him in a way we have not yet understood?" Chapter 10. The gathering took place in the drawing-room at Barton Lodge on a cool grey afternoon, the sort of afternoon when every object seems to wait for evening and the silver on the tray gives back a reluctant light. Inspector Slack had consented to the meeting because Miss Marple, with deceptive softness, had implied that if he refused, he might later regret having missed the simplest solution. Dr. Haydock was present by reason of Maud Cresswell's health. Dolly Bantry was present because she would have been present in any case. The rest came because they had been told that Mr. Hatherley's final papers were to be discussed. The bell stood upon a small table in the centre of the room. Cecily Vane entered first, very pale in black, carrying herself with that rigid composure which often marks persons nearest breaking point. Gerald Fenwick came close behind and stood near her without touching her. Vera Dale seated herself with elegance and coldness, one gloved hand resting on the arm of the chair. Lionel Carberry arrived last, apologizing lightly for a delay at the station. His face remained smooth, only a little pulse beat beneath one temple. Then they brought in Maud Cresswell in a wheeled invalid chair, borrowed from Dr. Haydock's surgery. Mrs. Harmon walked beside her like a bodyguard. The old woman's thin hands lay on the rug across her knees, but her eyes moved at once to Carberry and held there. A faint uneasiness passed round the room. Even Slack shifted. Miss Marple took her place near the mantel. She had brought her knitting, not because she needed it, but because people are less guarded when they are confronted by wool than by authority. "I am afraid," she said, "that this is a painful business, but painful things are often less so when they are put in order. Mr. Hatherley's death belongs to events which began at St. Honorius School, Stourbridge, in 1913. The old brass scholarship bell is the centre of them. Carberry gave a small impatient movement. "Must we endure village theatricals, Inspector?" Slack said shortly. "You may endure what clears a murder, sir." Miss Marple inclined her head. Years ago, scholarship trust papers were stolen. Edwin Vane was accused and dismissed, though innocent. Arthur Dale gave evidence which helped condemn him, and later lived to regret it bitterly. Mr. Hatherley suspected a miscarriage of justice, but chose silence to preserve his school. That silence ruined several lives. Vera Dale's mouth tightened. Gerald's hand closed upon the back of Cecily's chair. Recently, Mr. Marple continued, Hatherley reopened the matter. He found an old letter from Edwin Vane referring him to Mrs. Maud Cresswell. Mrs. Cresswell, seeing in the newspaper that the scholarship bell was to be shown at the fete, came to St. Mary Mead. She recognized not only the bell, but a man connected with the original theft. Every eye turned, but Carberry did not move. "She could not speak," said Miss Marple. "So she did something most ingenious. She blinked in Morse code. First she conveyed the word bell. Later she conveyed the word turn. Whoever understood those words would know that the bell itself concealed something." Carberry laughed thinly. "This would be amusing if it were not grotesque. You are basing accusations upon the eyelids of a paralytic woman." "No," said Miss Marple. "Upon what the bell contained." Slack looked round sharply. Cecily gave a small cry. Dolly drew breath like a delighted audience. Miss Marple placed the old packet on the table beside the bell, but did not yet open it. At this point, I think, the chief question for us all is not whether the witness blinked in Morse code she did, but who was so frightened by her message that he killed Mr. Hatherley and tried afterwards to murder Mrs. Cresswell. There are, after all, several people in this room who had cause to resent the dead man. Miss Vane, Mrs. Dale, Mr. Fenwick, even, in another sense, the dead Arthur Dale. Yet only one person had cause to fear, not merely exposure of the past, but identification in the present. Carberry's eyelids flickered once, almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple set the packet down between bell and witness. In a moment she said, "I should explain exactly what happened." Maud Cresswell, still staring at Carberry, began to blink again, very slowly as if to herself. Dot. Dash. Dot. The room, so full a moment before of shifting, breathing, human inconvenience, went quite still. What Maud was spelling now, and whether the man at whom she stared could continue to sit and listen, nobody yet knew. Chapter 11. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She never did, yet there are soft voices before which noise becomes impossible. "In villages," she said, "as no doubt in schools and chambers also, one sees the same pattern repeatedly. A small dishonesty is committed by a plausible person. A stricter, duller person is blamed because he is easy to sacrifice. A third person suspects the truth, but shrinks from scandal. Then time passes, and everybody hopes time has buried the matter. It never does." She laid one hand lightly on the bell. "Mrs. Cresswell was parlour-maid at St. Honorius in 1913. On the day of Speech Day, she saw papers in the Headmaster's study concerning the Scholarship Trust. Arthur Dale, second master, had discovered that the money and documents were being mishandled by a younger master named Lionel Bell. Mr. Dale wrote to Bell, threatening to expose him to Hatherley. Those papers, or some of them, were left in confusion after a quarrel. Mrs. Cresswell, frightened by footsteps and seeing the school bell close to hand, hid the incriminating packet inside its hollow handle. She meant to speak. Instead, Edwin Vane was accused almost at once, and she lost courage. Servants did in those days, and often with reason. Vera Dale shut her eyes. Cecily looked as though each word cost and healed her at once. Mr. Hatherley, Miss Marple went on, suspected. Chapter 12. 3 days later. The village had begun to recover that outward composure which English villages always assume after the worst possible events, as though murder, fraud, and moral collapse were all things best met by sweeping the front step and speaking of cabbages. The shops opened, the post came, the church clock struck as if human wickedness were no business of its own. Only the little knots of conversation at gates and in doorways showed that St. Mary Mead was still inwardly inflamed. At Danemead, however, the atmosphere was less excited than settled. Miss Marple sat by the window with her knitting. The laburnum had nearly finished, and a thin gold drift lay below it on the path. Haydock had called in after luncheon, and Dolly Bantry, who had no intention whatever of being absent from the final arrangement of things, had arrived almost simultaneously and with considerably less excuse. "Well," said Dolly after only a minute and a half of restraint, "now that Lionel Carberry has been charged, you may surely tell us everything in its proper order. I dislike justice when it is handed to one in lumps." Dr. Haydock accepted tea. "I should like one point particularly cleared up," he said. "Why Hatherley kept silence then, and why Carberry lost his head now. Men generally do not commit murder for ancient school scandals unless something very immediate has occurred." Miss Marple nodded. "No, it is almost always the present danger that kills, not the past sin. The past sin merely provides the weapon." She laid down her knitting for a moment. Lionel Carberry was Lionel Bell. That much is certain now. Slack has found the deed poll papers among his locked documents, and there are old records in Stourbridge to support the rest. In 1913, Bell was a younger master at St. Honorius, plausible, fair, agreeable when it suited him, and unscrupulous. Such men often prosper for quite a long time because they make other people feel clumsy and over-serious. "Very true," said Dolly darkly. Arthur Deo discovered that Bell had been handling the scholarship trust bonds improperly and, in fact, had diverted part of the money. Edwin Vane, poor man, was used as a convenient instrument. He was asked to fetch a paper, and later a receipt appeared with his forged signature upon it. Bell had practiced that signature rather stupidly, as clever people often do when vanity enters into crime, and one of those practice sheets survived in the Bell. Arthur Dale meant to expose Bell. He wrote to him. Mrs. Meyer, Cresswell, who was then a parlour-maid, saw enough to know that there had been a quarrel and that papers of importance were lying about in the headmaster's study after the school bell had gone. Hearing someone coming, and being terrified in the way servants then very naturally were of becoming mixed up in gentlemen's affairs, she hid the packet in the hollow handle of the scholarship bell. It was near to hand, and frightened people are always practical first and sensible afterwards. Dolly leaned forward. "Yes, but Hatherley?" Miss Marple's expression grew graver. Mr. Hatherley suspected the truth very early. He was not a fool, but Bell had one advantage over him. Hatherley, out of pride and misplaced confidence, had permitted Bell a freedom with the trust papers that ought never to have been allowed. He had been careless for the school's convenience. Careless because Belle seemed deficient. Careless because respectable men often think their own good intentions are a form of protection. Belle knew that. If the matter came out publicly, Belle could say quite truthfully that Hatherley's negligence had made it possible. To a stronger man, that would still have meant one thing only: admit the negligence and save the innocent. But Hatherley was, in that particular matter, weak. He feared scandal for the school, disgrace for himself, ruin for its reputation. Belle pressed. The evidence against Vane looked complete, and Hatherley chose silence. It was cowardice, but a cowardice mixed up with duty and vanity, which is the commonest and saddest kind. Dr. Haydock made a dissatisfied sound. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Quite. One likes one's cowards pure, but they rarely are." Outside, a cart went by, and the sound dwindled pleasantly down the lane. "For years," she continued, "nothing happened except the natural consequences. Edwin Vane was ruined. Arthur Dale regretted his own part in the affair until it poisoned his life. Vera Dale hardened herself against pity because pity is such cold food, and Hatherley grew old with a memory he could not lay down. Bell, meanwhile, changed his name and became Lionel Carberry. That too is characteristic. Men who live by arrangements and papers often have a touching faith that a new label changes the contents. Then Mr. Hatherley, among his old records, found Edwin Vane's unsent letter, the one naming Maud Cresswell as a witness. Almost at the same time, Maud herself saw in the newspaper that the old bell was to be displayed at the fete. She came to St. Mary Mead because memory had at last been given a shape. When she blinked Bell, she meant exactly what made the message dangerous: Bell the man, and the bell itself. One may say it was a very economical use of Morse. Dolly gave a short, delighted laugh, and Carberry understood, partly at once, I think. He went to the Blue Boar expecting to find a helpless old invalid. Instead, he found a witness trying to communicate. That alarmed him. He may first have thought she meant Bell, his old name. But when Hatherley sent for him again that evening, and when Miss Marple here had already spoken openly of the bell, he saw the whole dreadful possibility. Hatherley, too, had begun to understand. He examined the bell after Carberry left. The handle was stiff. He twisted it, and in doing so rang at once. That was the solitary note Dolly heard. Dolly sat up. I knew it mattered. Yes, most things do if one waits long enough. And then Hatherley did what many guilty elderly men do when they mean to repent. He postponed repentance until the morning, but put it into motion at once. He sent for Miss Marple. Unfortunately, he also sent for Carberry. That gave Carberry time. He returned later, after the household had quieted. Gerald Fenwick's visit had been noisy and honest, and therefore comparatively harmless. Carberry's second visit was neither. He came by the study window, which he knew was seldom fastened in warm weather. He found Hatherley with the bell partly loosened, and accused him, or was accused by him. There was a struggle. Hatherley fell and struck his temple, but the bruise did not kill him. Carberry used the cushion to suffocate him. Then he tried to open the bell completely, and could not manage it in his agitation. That is why the handle was left half-turned. Dr. Haydock set down his cup, and afterwards he wiped it. Yes, Elsie saw that. A most providential girl, Elsie. One of those persons who look as though they would forget their own names, yet remember everyone else's. Carberry lifted the bell and rubbed it with his handkerchief before the police arrived. It was an unnecessary action, which is why it mattered so much. Guilty people nearly always add one touch too many. Dolly said, and Maud. Miss Marple's face softened. She was his remaining danger. By walking with Elsie toward the inn and pretending concern, he learned enough about the arrangements there to try the back way later. He attempted to smother her as he had smothered Hatherley. Only Mrs. Carve. Harmon heard the knocking and came in time. That, I think, was the act that finally undid him. A man may persuade himself one murder is necessity, two are a habit. Dolly shivered slightly. But at the meeting, she said, what made him break? Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Pride again. I had the packet from the bell, of course, though he did not know how much it contained. I set it beside the bell and spoke of the past. He might still have sat quiet if he had been wiser. But then Mrs. Cresswell began to blink while looking straight at him. It was very slow and painful, but perfectly legible. What was she spelling? Haydock asked. Miss Marple's needles clicked once. Bell, she said. Not Carberry. Bell. It was much worse. To be identified by the name he had buried was more than he could bear. He sprang toward the table. Inspector Slack, who for once was exactly where he ought to be, stopped him, and in stopping him heard Mr. Darnby. Carberry say, quite distinctly, she had no right to keep it all these years. There is really very little one can do after that, except charge a man. Dolly drew a long, satisfied breath. My dear Jane, it is almost disappointing that criminals will speak. Oh, they nearly always do, said Miss Marple. One only has to give them the right word. For a little while, there was silence. The room felt lighter now, though the matter itself remained sad enough. At last, Dr. Haydock said, more gently, and the others. Mr. Hatherley's codicil was properly signed before his death, so Miss Vane is provided for, and Mrs. Vane is provided for. Dale's annuity will stand. Gerald Fenwick seems likely to marry Miss Vane as soon as grief and formalities permit, which I think wise. When truth has been so long delayed, one ought not to delay happiness as well. Edwin Vane's name will be publicly cleared by the governors of what remains of St. Honorius. Mrs. Cresswell knows that now. She was very quiet when Miss Vane told her, but she took the girl's hand and held it a long time. That is often more eloquent than speaking. And Vera Dale? Asked Dolly. Miss Marple considered. Mrs. Marple, Dale has had the hard discipline of business, and I do not think it leaves one quickly. But it will do her good, perhaps, to know that Arthur Dale was right in the end, and not merely weak. There is a great comfort in being allowed one's dead honestly. Dolly nodded, unexpectedly moved. The afternoon slanted further west. In the church beyond the yews the half-hour bell began to ring, plain and unambiguous across the gardens. Miss Marple listened. There, she said, that is much better. A bell ought to ring what it means. It is only people who insist upon having two meanings at once. And, taking up her knitting again, she allowed the sound to die away into the mild and orderly silence of the village, where at last the old wrong had been spoken aloud and could trouble the living no more.